There was a time where it was absurd to consider that a game was capable of sophisticated storytelling. Games were a medium to get some kicks out of, not one to divulge a meaningful plot or handle narrative themes. And among those that possess a story, most resigned themselves to pitting a corporation of some description against a well-meaning or completely silent protagonist. Dialogue restricted itself to exposition and one-liners, plotting was centered around set pieces. Breaking the norm has never really been an accomplishment for the many, and it wasn't until the latter part of the last decade that the medium has really come into its own on this frontier. And one of the few developers out there who tried, with varying degrees of success, to focus on themes and character and balance it against suitable mechanics was Remedy Entertainment. Cinematic, gritty, with an almost amateurish homemade B-movie charm to nearly every single one of their titles, they've most certainly managed to carve out a name for themselves on the wall of innovators. This mini-series of videos exists to satisfy my own curiosity on the matter, to explain the how and why, to examine both the differences and stark similarities across their core entries. So join me for an up-close and personal with Max Payne. Max Payne marries its story and gameplay by casting its protagonist as an age-old archetype, that of the hard-boiled, no-nonsense detective who views the world through a thick lens of unflinching cynicism. One who lives from metaphor to metaphor, minutes between the second-long shootouts, having a neon danger sign over every dame he's ever met. The approach in his case was to place a well-meaning, level-headed character in a world turned upside down with outrageous absurdities and falsehoods, leaving him to put together the pieces to reform a clear picture of the truth. The world around him sees itself painted in a wildly exaggerated manner, in its tropes, its diegetic dialogue, its plot, and most notably, its gameplay. And against such a backdrop of sensational caricatures, Max himself is painted as more of a real person than he'd otherwise be. Throughout the stream of spectacular situations that play out over the course of the first two games, Max himself is a constant. From the death of his wife to the death of his newfound lover at the end of a gang war, Max Payne proves himself to be a man with the right intentions in a world saturated with wrongs. The midlife crisis explored in the third game is a grounded twist on his character, but it isn't one I intend on discussing in this series. However, Max Payne isn't known widely for its plot, but its signature brand of gameplay. Max Payne 1 was one of the first games to bring bullet time to the table, fresh off the heels of The Matrix, accentuating every shot, every leap, and every casualty that came with a firefight. It easily proves itself to be more than just a gimmick, its obvious overpoweredness balanced out by the sheer lethality of bullets fired in your direction, which itself is pushed to its own extreme in the first game in a way that no other action game of that era was. It sees Max with a severe allergy to bullets, more so than most action game protagonists. This allergy moves from severe to almost instantly fatal as you move up the difficulty levels. Frustrating as it is, the degree of challenge it presents is a core tenet of the game, both mechanically and thematically. As with any film in this genre, the singular protagonist all on his lonesome is almost hopelessly outmatched against a swarm of goons in just about any scenario. Gunfights hardly last more than a couple seconds from your first bullet to your last. The tension is palpable as the bullets go off right above you while you duck behind the closest thing you can use for cover. By constantly pitting you as the underdog, every tiny bit of that quicksilver meter represents a ray of hope to make it out of that fight alive. The momentum generated by these pause and pop out moments, strung together across a series of linear levels with the bare minimum of contextual decoration, works wonders. These self-made set pieces truly make the fiction of the setting that much more tangible. On the other side of every door, you can overhear goons shit-talking you unaware of your presence, and when they say, "We've got him outnumbered," you know full well those words most certainly carry their weight.
Go get him. No, wait, you go get him. You go and get him.
And so the bullet time acts as your equalizer, a means to end the fight before they even know it's really started. It serves as a self-glorifying means to build your own set pieces, especially if you're willing to put in the work. A well-played encounter is cinematic, awe-inspiring, as you twist, dodge, and dive your way through a maelstrom of bullets. A fumbled one, on the other hand, serves a great role as a comic outtake in an action film. In terms of actual gameplay, the nature of its difficulty means your experience will wildly oscillate between two extremes. A slick and smooth shootout that has you feeling like an ace, or a sequence of increasingly frustrated quick loads to find a choreography that works. Unlike the more AI-driven combat of games like Half-Life or F.E.A.R, gunfights are presented as more of a puzzle than anything else. And to me, seeing as anything but that is an easy road to frustration. The first game implements a dynamic difficulty system akin to Resident Evil 4, wherein your performance dictates the damage dealt and received. However, in the case of an action puzzler like this, it tends to build frustration, as it merely adds more variables than letting you plot your way through constants. And so ideally, you always want to be playing your best, since ensuring the AI is always at its hardest makes it easier to plan around them rather than having them constantly scale your damage. I get mad while playing some games, sure, but I feel rage quitting is something that's beyond my temperament most of the time. Like any human, however, I too have a breaking point, and I reached it in the second act while facing a quote-unquote boss. Killing the boss wasn't the worst part, no, it was the 27 restarts that preceded it. I don't know if it was just me, but the AI felt like it had ungodly reaction times, to the point where I could bullet time my way through a door and still be instantly shot right the instant the AI got eyes on me. At the end of the day, combat in this game is more a puzzle to be solved than anything else. A frustrating puzzle, no doubt, but not without its fair share of fun. Next up, Max Payne 2's combat, because the latter half of my video just flows better discussing it here instead. It's absurdly easy on the lower difficulties, letting Max soak up a ton more damage before letting him throw in the towel. To go with this, the scale of combat, the number of enemies and frequency of encounters have all been sized up compared to the first game. This brings with it an issue that it has in common with Doom 2016. The sameness and ease of combat on those lower difficulties. Since almost every weapon is consistently provided with ammo, since every tool is almost always at your disposal, and because there's so much breathing room for mistakes, it doesn't really incentivize the kind of careful planning and tension that defined combat in Max Payne 1, the yet-to-come Alan Wake, and even the original Doom. Those games utilize small groups of effectively used enemies in strategically predetermined locations to throw you off, and balanced it via a combination of damage values and ammo distribution. Because weapons in these games are so distinct from each other, controlling the types of ammunition available to a player in a level, along with the number of and types of enemies spawned, forcefully induces more cautious and creative play. Max Payne 2 may play similarly to Max Payne 1, but it most certainly does not feel the same. And I personally think that it's for the worse. Max Payne 1 came out in an era where games had yet to prove their legitimacy as an art form. As much as it pulls from the films that inspire it, its cinematic allure most certainly does not stem directly from them. Rather, it comes from the stylized comic cutscenes you still hear people talk about to this day alongside its gameplay, both of which are simply supported by everything else. You might have noticed the silly face Max has got on. It comes courtesy of Sam Lake, one of the founders of Remedy Entertainment, as well as one of their main writers. The facial animations just involve switching between different pictures of his face wrapped around the same endgame model. Now, most of the faces that populate the game world belong to staff members and their friends and family. This adds to the DIY amateurish charm I mentioned earlier, lending a sort of B-movie feel once you're made aware of the fact. And the funny thing is, it manages to be a gritty, serious mob story fueled by vengeance all the way through. If this had been a movie, it'd be something you'd turn in as a student project, not one you'd expect at a theater near you. And yet here it is, in all its goofy glory, working its magic to pull you in. Max states it's only a cliche up until the moment you're living it, providing a wonderful bit of juxtaposition between the miserable world he sees around him and the entertaining styrofoam models we see on screen. During a particular drug-induced dream sequence, Max shows us how fucked up that juxtaposition really is to him.
The truth was a burning green crack through my brain, weapon statistics hanging in the air, glimpsed out of the corner of my eye, endless repetition of the act of shooting, time slowing down to show off my moves, the paranoid feel of someone controlling my every step. I was in a computer game. Funny as hell, it was the most horrible thing I could think of.
Max Payne 1 today is very much an anachronism, not just because of its small budget and team, but because of the resultant oddities and charm that they brought. It's unashamed of what it is, and is perfectly content to submerge itself in a sea of hammy storytelling cliches, dialed up to 11, ironically further humanizing its tragic protagonist. The character of Max Payne lies somewhere between the characterless Nazi killing machine you play in Wolf 3D and the somber, introspective BJ Blazkowicz of the new Wolfenstein games. And it's the fact that it's a product of its time and the eccentricities that come with it that truly make it memorable to me. The circumstances surrounding its production and the era it released in make it an experience that's difficult to recapture. I want to make one thing clear before we go on. What I'm about to ramble on about for the next couple minutes are my subjective view of Max Payne 2's offerings. But I know this for a fact: the least I can do is offer an interesting perspective. On all fronts, Max Payne 2 plays like an industry-standard sequel, reiterating and attempting to improve on its predecessor's positive traits. And on a surface level, you'd be right. But anyone who's familiar with Remedy's catalog can tell you that the themes the game explores have more in common with what was to come than what came before, particularly Alan Wake. On one hand, it's the continuation of a downward spiral for our hard-boiled detective. On the other hand, it exemplifies the deterministic nature of a story that protagonists universally fall prey to. Either that, or you could see it as a boring paint-by-number sequel. Subjectivity being what it is, you'd likely be right either way. I suppose this warrants your mileage may vary to go with the story. Is Max intended to be taken seriously? This is less a story, in my opinion, about a vengeful cop who was wronged, and more about a fictional character realizing his story was written in advance. As someone who's played Alan Wake prior to playing this train of thought resonates much more strongly with me. Choice, or the lack thereof, is one of the primary focuses of this story, one that sees its reappearance in every Remedy game hereafter, in one form or another. Max, notably more self-aware of the precarious path that he walks now, ponders over the predetermined nature of the role he seems to have taken. There are no choices, nothing but a straight line. Even in retrospect, had he made another decision, it wouldn't have been him making that decision, and it most certainly wouldn't have been him standing right there thinking it over. To further this, I'd like to bring up a certain TV show that plays in an otherwise arbitrary room in Max Payne 1. Address Unknown. It starts out with a talking flamingo, and only gets weirder and darker from there on out. In Max Payne 1, there was just one short episode that played out, with the likely intention of simply unnerving the player with its uncanny dialogue that seemed relevant somehow in spite of its absurdity.
And the flamingo speaks again.
I
I have no idea what that means. And that's when I always wake up to my own scream. In that brightly lit white hospital room, strapped to my bed.
In Max Payne 2, it sees itself strongly tied to the core threads of the story, and enjoys further fascination from me having witnessed this parallelism explored in Alan Wake. And while the high budget meant Max now had a fresh face modeled after an actual actor, the protagonist of the show, John Mira, is yet again played by the man himself, Sam Lake. Over the course of a couple nightmare sequences that grace the game's acts, Max sees himself hallucinating bits and pieces of the show, outright replacing John Mira with himself in a few scenes. The amount of effort that has gone into setting up these parallels shifts the narrative focus from the surface level generic mob story that the game tells, and leads me to posit that Address Unknown is the said focus instead. The show sees John chasing his murderous doppelganger, John Mira, through noir York City. Yes, really, in a state of constant paranoia. A disconnect between John and the real world is gradually established, one that eventually sees him through a psychotic break out of a mental institute. And the final episodes reveal that John Mira may not have been a different person after all, but a realization of the fucked up side of his mind he didn't know existed. A pit so dark he didn't even realize how far down it went. Or as Alan Wake would put it,
it's not a lake. It's an ocean.
and as the unifying element, a lens to view the story of Max Payne 2 through, it does seem to work. However, my fondness for Address Unknown goes beyond what it does for this game's story. It has much more in common with Alan Wake's American Nightmare than it does with any of the titles Remedy has released. And I believe that Alan Wake would scarcely have been as good as it was, were it not for Remedy creating this experimental series of wacky shorts. If you haven't watched the episodes yourself already, I suggest giving them a shot, especially if you intend on watching the Alan Wake video I'll be doing after this one, seeing as it centers itself on the degree of true freedom offered to characters within a creative work. If the symbolism doesn't get to you, the game outright beats this concept in you via the funhouse level modeled after the show. You first visit it in the chapter titled A Linear Sequence of Scares. Drawing attention to the fact is Max is oddly self-aware in a monologue, in a manner that almost satirizes genre convention via cartoonishly evil cardboard cutouts and overly menacing voices. As he walks through the single path that takes him to the end of the funhouse, Max comes to the eventual realization that a happy ending simply isn't a possibility for him. He never sees his happily ever after. The funhouse is a metaphor for the unchangeable, tragic story that he's forced to live out. The tragic hard-boiled detective lives off the moment-to-moment catharsis offered by booze and bullets. This is his fate. People were always going to betray him, allies never what they seem, and his lover was always going to die. Because that's just how the story goes. The inevitability of the paths these characters walk is drawn attention to even in the last chapter, as Mona bitterly mutters to herself that as much as she denied it, she wound up the damsel in distress anyways. What passes for love between Max and Mona is questionable. They've spent no less than a couple days together, and no suspension bridge could be high enough to build a romantic relationship between these two. Even Max wonders to himself if it ever made sense at all. But it all comes full circle at the end as he says to himself,
I had a dream of my wife. She was dead. But it was all right.
Not because he's a dick, not because he found a new guilt in Mona's death, but throughout the introspective moments over the course of these two games, he's finally come to the realization that he never had a choice in the matter. The death of his wife, the death of Mona, they were inevitabilities in his story. They were catalysts to drive Max's character as the vengeful cop out for revenge. Much like the juxtaposition between the way Max and the player see the world, what seems like a fate doomed from the start for Max is a mere game to the player, a literal funhouse. Max Payne 2 begins at the end, our detective looking back upon the events we have yet to experience, asking if there ever really was a choice to make. The linear chapters all see him down a single path, immutable, unchanging, funneling him down to the same damn ending. It's a certainty that the story would see itself at this point. It's expected that the player would sit up and say, saw it from a mile away, because that's just how the story goes. Max has no say in the matter. If this went any other way, it wouldn't be the same story. But you, the player, you're the only one who's in this who has any amount of agency. You have a choice. A binary choice. To play or not to play? That is the question.